Hello again. In this lecture, I want to shift from the medieval world into the early modern world, especially focusing on the high reformers, Martin Luther and Jean Calvin. Now, before we go on, I want to pause a little bit here to kind of sum up where we've been. In some ways, in moving into the Reformation, we're moving into the edge of the modern world. These thinkers begin to be people who are remarkably like us in our thoughts and our patterns of belief and behavior. And many of the assumptions that they have, or they begin to formulate, are assumptions that we have as well. But to understand this, it will be useful to remind us of something of where we've been up till now. We've seen some very early ancient Near Eastern accounts of the combat myth. We saw the heritage of classical Greek, both tragic and philosophical in its dimensions. We saw the initial formulations of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian scriptures, Christian New Testament, and then Rabbinic Judaism and a series of Christian views and Islamic views, culminating in some ways for us in the classical formulations of these things in the High Middle Ages. Now, at the threshold of the modern world, we come to two thinkers who are profoundly influenced by the past, but also profoundly innovative, and in some ways set the terms for much that will come, precisely in the ways that they play with and resist the inheritance they received from the past. We'll see in different ways that Martin Luther, a trained medieval scholastic, someone who was deeply versed in the thought of Aquinas and Anselm, among others, understands evil in a particular way. And we'll see in a second that he, in interesting ways, sees the devil as in some significant ways like a theologian. Calvin, on the other hand, is not a classically trained theologian or philosopher. He's not a scholastic. He, in fact, was a trained Renaissance humanist lawyer. Right? It's interesting to think about Jean Calvin, who we think of as, in some ways, the classic theologian. He's actually trained as a lawyer and as a humanist, someone who was interested in literature and literary texts. And Calvin, where Luther sees, and in some ways plays up this metaphor of the devil as a kind of theologian, Calvin sees the challenge of evil to lie in the endlessly inventive character of the human imagination, the interiority of the human, something that other Renaissance figures, again, the world he was trained in, identified and praised in humans. Calvin sees as precisely the locus of the problem of evil. Now, in the Reformation, thinkers took up with new seriousness the possibility that there was a genuine positivity to Satan's power that was in some ways at odds with traditional Augustinian and scholastic understandings of evil, out of which these thinkers had sprung. And this was in important ways because of the context out of which the Reformation itself came. The Reformation emerged in a world where there was an increasing, slowly growing concern about the stability of the created order. There had been massive social change, the beginnings of an industrial revolution were happening, and a booming economy. All of this happened in the wake of probably the greatest catastrophe that the West has known in the last 4,000 years, and that was the Black Death. In the 1 year of 1348, from the port city of Kaffa in the Black Sea, stretching all the way into Scotland and Portugal, the plague that became known as the Black Death, what we think of now, we think it was the bubonic plague, swept across Western Europe and killed an enormous swath of the population. Fully somewhere between a third and a half of the population died from this plague. If you caught the plague from the first showing of the symptoms, from the beginning of welts on your arms, maybe a light fever, you had about 4 or 5 days to live. And roughly 4 out of 5 people who caught the plague did not survive. Thus, 1348. At the end of that year, fully between 1/2 and 1/3 of the population of Europe was gone, and gone in a heartbeat. Imagine if at this time next week you woke up and half of your family were dead. That's the kind of trauma that's put on the entirety of Western European civilization. After the Black Plague, there were enormous social changes. First of all, labor had begun to be much rarer, and so peasants were actually able to agitate for more rights and more wealth. So you get the beginnings of an actual shifting of wealth in Europe, away from the old model of serfdom, more towards an attempt to actually generate a peasant class that had some property of its own. About 100 years after this, in 1453, Constantinople, the last vestige that the Western Europe sees of the Roman Empire, the last direct connection to the classical past, falls to the Ottoman Turks. Apart from Russia and a few sovereigns in the East, all of Christendom, all of Christianity, at least as the West understands it, is now contained within the boundaries of Europe itself. And at about this time, Europeans, having recovered from the Black Death, begin to send out their tendrils of exploration and trade on ships that go all the way around the world. Remember that Columbus discovers the New World. He discovers the Americas in 1492. So the discovery and exploration of the Americas is happening at exactly the same time that the Reformation is happening. Furthermore, the capacity of humans to know what is going on in this changing social order, intellectually developing ideas of new ways of understanding and organizing society and new ways of understanding and organizing the cosmos, are growing as well. There's a sense that knowledge of the world and of our past was outstripping the capacity of medieval scholastic modes of knowing to accommodate it. The late Middle Ages also, though, were a deeply fraught time, full of dynamism, change and reaction, plague, we've seen that already, wars, rumors of wars, and powerful currents of religious energy. Luther may have been the very, very most famous reformer of this period, but almost a century before Luther, another reformer had appeared, Jan Hus, who, had he survived, might very well have had a reformation of his own in that day. But he was caught and executed at the Council of Constance in the early 15th century. Sometimes, to some people, it can seem as if Luther and the whole Reformation appeared like a comet streaking across the sky. But in fact, the world of his time was crowded with just the sorts of energies that enabled a Reformation to take root and grow. There were profound anxieties about the apocalypse, and particularly about the idea of the Antichrist, the idea of a figure who comes and seems promisingly messianic, but is actually evil cloaked in goodness, corruption hidden in glorious magnificence. There was a deep spiritual and intellectual paranoia abroad in the land in the late Middle Ages. All this is manifest in late medieval theology, especially in its renewed emphasis, and this is the generations before Luther, its renewed emphasis on the revolutionary power of God and the utter unknowable abyss of God's absolute power and will. In different ways, Luther and Calvin will eventually take up this heritage and use this emphasis on the power and sovereignty of God in ways that are revolutionary. Let me say something about Luther first. Martin Luther started off his career, we can say, as a monk and a professor. He ended as a preacher, a hymnodist, a writer of hymns, and a husband and father of 6. He and his wife, Catalina, who was a former nun herself, ended up having 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. He lived from 1483 to 1546. Luther worked out of anxieties, as I've said, that were abroad in his day. larger concerns about one's personal relationship to God and the identity of the person in an age of increasing wealth and social change, particularly when people were growing increasingly impatient with the corruptions of the church. Now, for Luther, in some important ways, the church is a secondary expression of the relationship between God and the human. And this is very much in opposition to church thinking of his time, which wanted to put the church between God and the individual. For Luther, God is absolutely powerful and completely sovereign. But this omnipotent God, complete sovereign God, is mysteriously hidden from us. All we have in this life is the God visible in the Scriptures in Jesus Christ. The distance between the human Christ, who teaches and preaches and dies on the cross and is raised again, is the space in which the devil plays with us, that distance between the all-powerful God and the human Christ. Now, Satan, for Luther, is a powerful, powerful figure, but in an interesting and subtle way. He's not a monster or a bogeyman. Satan is an inner power, able to corrupt faith. Satan is immaterial. Satan will not touch you. Satan has no physical menace to you. The devil, rather, for Luther, is a tempter and a deceiver, a deluding agent who would obstruct, trick, and mystify humans into making terrible choices. The devil attempts to mislead you, to corrupt and deflect you in order to get you to hurt yourself. The devil works, that is, by seducing you into bad thinking. The devil can, and most definitely does, quote Scripture. The devil is a theologian. Now, certainly some of Luther's depiction of the devil comes out of his own conflicts with other Christian intellectuals and leaders of the churches at that time. Certainly some of it comes out of Luther's own intellectual anxieties and paranoias. But something there is also extremely, I think, psychologically acute. For this devil's power does not come through sheer muscular strength, but rather through how he can work to disrupt your own proper reasoning. This Satan may not be very terrifying at first, but what he lacks for Luther in grandeur, he more than makes up for in subtlety. The devil comes to people who are serious about being good Christians, who are trying to be sincere. That's who the devil strikes. The people who are just happy to eat, drink, and be merry because they don't care about the fate of their immortal souls, the devil's already got those. He doesn't have to worry about those people. He's not interested in them. He's trying to get the people who he doesn't have yet. Those are the people who the devil is most interested in. And in Luther's own experience, he reports this in a number of sermons and also treatises. He says, I encounter the devil most immediately and most frequently just at those moments when I am tempted to rely on myself. Right? In other words, the devil is the insinuation that maybe I should be the one to figure this thing out. Maybe I can do this on my own. Maybe I don't need the help of God. Maybe I don't have to pray for Christ's grace in accomplishing this task. Go back to Eve in the garden, at least as Paul, and after Paul, Augustine and Luther himself, will interpret that. What happens to Eve when she sees the fruit? Again, she's like God. She feels that she can make this judgment. Just as God saw that creation is good, now Eve sees the fruit is good. For Luther, this is a paradigmatic example of how the devil gets inside people's minds who are, in some sense, trying to be good people, but manages to warp them in disastrous ways. And this gets to one of the most important phrases of Luther's work, and that is works righteousness. The devil is all about works righteousness. What is that? That works righteousness is the idea that we are made good by what we do, by what we accomplish. That in some sense, we have to earn or deserve our salvation. The devil is all about this idea. The devil loves the idea, insofar as he can insinuate it into our minds, that we would have anything to do with our salvation, and thus could claim any credit for our salvation. And for what Luther calls the theology of glory, a theology which is all about glorifying ourselves, talking about ourselves as achievers, people who have accomplished something. For Luther, the response to evil that we should employ when we are confronted with these temptations is simple. You can't engage the devil. You can't resist the devil. That's not what you should do. You should not see this temptation and say, I will fight that. That is, in fact, already playing the devil's game, because now you are trying to fight the devil on your own. Instead, Luther thinks, you have to appeal to Christ to protect you from the devil. Now, in this way, Luther's big innovation really is the kind of remarkable character that Satan is in his writings. And in recent years, many scholars have emphasized the reality of Satan for Luther. But in fact, the Satan that is real for Luther is a Satan who is really quite immaterial, who works wholly by means of messing with human subjectivity, with messing with our interiority, with our pride, and with our thought. For Luther, this devil is external, able to affect only our thinking and our way of seeing the world. This devil is not a muscular threat to us. Instead, the picture of evil that Luther is offering us here is not one of threat, of immediate danger or peril. It is rather of deception and obscurity. Evil doesn't only lurk in uncertainty and confusion. That's a classic line about Luther's thought. That for Luther, uncertainty is in fact a sign of sin. Well, that might be true, but it's not quite exact. Evil actually is uncertainty and confusion. To counteract this picture of evil, then, Luther insists on the absolute governance of the world by a sovereign and providential deity. We may not know how that God is governing the world, but nonetheless, we know that God is in charge. In fact, God's providential mastery over creation is so important to Luther that he's willing to ascribe a responsibility for evil, even evil, to this God. As early as his quite early work on the bondage of the will, one he writes only a couple years after he writes his famous 95 Theses, Luther emphasizes that God's providential control is over all aspects of our lives, even the evil aspects. How? This is a mystery for Luther. And here he appeals to the idea of the inscrutability of divine providence, the lives of Abraham and Job, and the prophetic tradition's interpretation of the travails of ancient Israel. But what Luther knows is that any attempt to master God's providential control over history on our part will fail. All we must do and all we can do is appeal to Christ as our Savior in this situation. Direct, immediate resistance to evil turns out to be, for Luther, a kind of collapse into evil itself, because once again, we would be trying to rely on ourselves. Now, with the thinker of Jean Calvin, we have a very different picture. Calvin is about, 25 years or so younger than Luther. He's born in 1509 and he dies in 1564. He's trained in a very different world. He's trained as a French humanist, trained as a lawyer. And in those roles, his background and his expectations about what happens in the world are very different from a medieval scholastic monk's, which is what Luther was. Calvin, though, became the second great reformer after Luther, and he eventually settled and lived out most of his life in Geneva, which he made the headquarters of the International Reformation. Now, Calvin's, unlike Luther's, in interesting ways, was a reformation of refugees. It was a cosmopolitan Reformation of fugitives. First of all, of political fugitives. Many of the people who came to Geneva, and Calvin himself, were actually there because they had fled from other places, fled from persecution elsewhere. And then they went out from Geneva to the rest of the world, preaching the gospel in new ways, but always alert to the fact that they had been, at one point, refugees. And not just literal refugees, but more profoundly for Calvin, theologically, refugees from Satan on the roads of the earth. In fact, it's interesting to think about how often Calvin's examples, his theological stories, include travelers on the roads. Luther's, in contrast, often take place with people sitting down at tables drinking beer. Luther loved beer. Or desks writing. Luther loved nothing more than writing with beer beside him. Or in bed. Luther did love sleeping. Calvin, on the other hand, always talks about Christians as being on the road. This is a Reformation that is emphasizing the Exodus character of the Christian life. The idea that everyone is a pilgrim in this world. Now, famously, Calvin, of course, you think about Calvin, you think about what? You think about predestination, right? And the idea of the total depravity of humanity. And these are two important things that we need to take a little time to explain. First of all, let's be as upfront as possible about Calvin's understanding of predestination. He was pretty serious about it. In fact, and this sounds like something the Harlem Globetrotters would do, but the proper theological term for what Calvin believed in and affirmed is a supralapsarian double predestination. That's a pretty impressive thing. It sounds like, again, something you'd expect an Olympic gymnast to do or something. What it means is that Calvin believes that the blessed are predestined to heaven and the damned are predestined to hell, and they are both predestined in those ways, that's a double predestination, from before the fall, superlapsus, before the lapse, before the fall. So Calvin thinks that before humans fell, God foreknew and preordained, not just knew, but determined, ordered, willed, that some would be blessed and some would be damned. That's an astonishing thought. How does he get there? How does Calvin think this is a useful theological thought? Because, in fact, he does. What's interesting about the discussion of providence in his masterwork, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, is that Calvin takes it as a crucial thing that God's providential control is over all aspects of our lives, even the evil aspects. In fact, Calvin took the doctrine of election as itself a kind of doctrine of comfort. We used to joke that when we send students out to the job market in academia, that it's only when you're trying to figure out where you will be working in the next year, where you will get an academic job, and you realize that you have no control over the market, no control over who interviews you, who picks up your resume, who doesn't. When you realize the utter lack of control you have over your life, it's only at that point that Calvin's doctrine of election truly becomes a doctrine of comfort for you, right? What the doctrine of election means is really quite simple. It means that, in fact, everything about you is outside of your immediate control. And again, Calvin thinks this is a good thing. This is good news for Calvin. Why? This gets us to the second point, Calvin's doctrine of total depravity. Now, total depravity here, his assessment of the human as totally depraved, is not nihilism. The human is not utterly evil, just thoroughly corrupted. The human's nature has been changed, deranged in the fall, but it's not per se evil. The sinful human is perverted, but because the human is essentially creative, again, this is a residue of Calvin's Renaissance humanism here, this means that the mind is an unceasingly laboring factory of idols. For Calvin, the mind is a fertile ground for evil, lustful and ever-changing. Humans then are trapped in sin, but they're not actually compelled to do this. Rather, it is the way their psychologies are set up that they want to sin. Their desires are so warped that they actually desire to sin. They desire to make idols of things. Now, this means that absent God's providential control over your life, you are yourself certain to send yourself to hell. It is only the mysterious, gracious providence of God's generous love that allows any of us to be corrected from our own completely idolatrous, own personal ways to move towards salvation in any solid way. So for Calvin, unlike Luther, for example, there's very little really active place for Satan in his thinking. There's no need for a very powerful Satan. The human mind does more than enough good duty for Calvin in making evil happen in the world. Calvin's Renaissance humanism, as it were, allows for the idea that the human has a great deal of power. But of course, what that does is turn the human's capacity for power directly to evil. Interestingly, for Calvin, the metaphor of seduction into evil is not a big one, as it was for Luther. Instead, what you get is a metaphor of drowning. Evil, sin, death, indirectly the devil, these things always threaten to drown you for Calvin. And the drowning is a falling back into your own self, a falling back into your own ego. That's the thing for Calvin that hell is. It's not so much a direct assertion of pride as it is a collapse back into the self. Now, what happens in the Christian life to resist this for Calvin, and this is the other huge development that Calvin offers, the rest of modernity, and definitely the rest of Protestant Christianity, is sanctification. The practice of sanctification is the practice whereby those Christians who have been saved come ever more fully to live into their lives as sanctified and holy people. Evil resists sanctification because evil is slothful and narcissistic and turned inward. Sanctification is a growing deepening of our energy and a growing deepening of our turning outward to one another and to God. Sanctification explains why, for Calvin and for all who came after him, the Reformed tradition of Protestant Presbyterianism that came after him, why discipline is so important. Discipline is the central, immediate strategy to counteract evil. If evil wants us to lounge around in ourselves, to wallow narcissistically in ourselves, to drown ourselves in ourselves, the remedy to all of this is to practice discipline and to be disciplined about what we do in every day, and by doing this, to come to see ourselves aright, to see our own sins, which are hidden from us and which our mind continually tries to distract us from by luring us to think about other things. And to be able, in seeing our sins, to see them as things that God has saved us from. What you must do then is not do anything, but understand yourself as redeemed by God. And part of that redemption is a renunciation of your own perpetual effort to hide from your reality. When you give that up, when you give up that duplicity, that self-deception, you come to see that, in fact, you're completely screwed up. Again, nature is deranged for Calvin. Grace, and through grace, the reading of the Bible, which functions as a kind of set of spectacles for Calvin in seeing the world aright, helps you come to see the world as properly a place of sin. And this is very important for Calvin, and something that is often forgotten, both by critics of Calvin and sometimes by Calvin's heirs. Christians are not free from sin for Calvin. In a way, they're on the way to being free from sin, but in another way, they are never more sensible of sin, their own and others, than when they have been saved. In fact, in the process of sanctification, after they have been justified, that is the only time they are able genuinely to see the sins they have been caught up in. Knowledge of sin, then, is in a way a sign of election, and it is also a sign of retrospection. It's a sign of reflection on your history that makes sense of that history in a new kind of way. And this is important. A later Calvinist, someone we'll look at later in this lecture series actually, Karl Barth, famously said, famously to people like myself, famously said, only Christians can sin. And what he meant by that is interesting. He means that it is only from within the condition of attempting to live out a genuinely Christian life, only from within the Christian story can a person come to see who they have been and who they still all too much are, namely, a sinner. To solve the problem of evil, then, it's arguable that in certain ways, both Luther and Calvin kind of incorporated evil more immediately into God than anyone else we've seen so far, or at least seen recently. Luther and Calvin both understood themselves to be challenging traditional medieval notions of good and evil, whereas evil in the form of Satan had been admitted earlier to be under God's final control by the late Middle Ages, anyway. Christian understandings of Satan had again begun to slip away from under God's sovereignty, so that Lucifer seemed to a lot of late medieval thinkers and believers a rival independent force to God that humans had to contend with on their own. That's a fairly anxiety-inducing thought. Luther and Calvin both responded to this, paradoxically perhaps, by diminishing human power and strengthening Satan's subtlety and wiles, but only because that would make humans more likely to despair of their own power and appeal instead to God's infinite power. But the effect of this is to further the interiorization of evil, its deepening in our inner selves, its representation as inside of us. Essentially, for both Luther and Calvin, the struggle with evil takes place in the human soul, not in the cosmos, as in, say, the book of Revelations, or in human history, as, say, with St. Augustine, but rather in the lowly individual. Now, innovation is not necessarily a bad thing. It's possible to revolutionize understandings of evil and not be condemned for it. We see how far and how quickly this went with our next figure, Niccolò Machiavelli.